What's up, folks? I'm Chris, your NFL writer here at Occupy Fantasy, here with a look at week number 2 of the United Football League season, kicking off this weekend on Saturday with a game between the San Antonio Brahmas and the Memphis Showboats. If you watched week 1's video, I talked about how we were expecting the San Antonio Brahmas to surprise and be one of the best offenses in the league. That did come to fruition, and we will get a chance to see them repeat that effort right away here in week number 2. More on that in a little bit. My favorite play on this slate is going to be St. Louis Battlehawks running back Wayne Gallman. Gallman is the starting running back for the Battlehawks. He had 37 snaps versus just 22 for backup Jacob Sailors in last week's game against the Michigan Panthers. Heartbreaking loss for the St. Louis Battlehawks on a last-second field goal there for the Panthers, but they will look to redeem themselves here in their home opener against the Arlington Renegades in week number 2. Big game on the ground for both Birmingham's CJ Marable and Ricky Person Jr. against these Renegades last week. It will be Gallman who stands to benefit the most from that here in week number 2. So he is the first player into my lineups this week. I think Gallman in a really good spot to succeed at home for the Battlehawks. Usual agenda of the NFL DFS and now UFL DFS videos that I have for you all. We like to look at the biggest spreads in the betting markets. I took a look at the DraftKings Sportsbook numbers for this game. The teams that are favored the most heavily are most likely to have running backs that are playing in favorable game scripts, right? So that's why we want to look at this information for DFS purposes. The Birmingham Stallions are going to be the biggest favorite here in week number 2. They are favored by 6.5 points in their matchup with the Michigan Panthers on Sunday afternoon, and that means we are going to want to look at the $8,900 CJ Marable as another running back that we're super interested in playing this week. Marable and Ricky Person actually did split reps somewhat evenly in week number 1. Person actually ended up outscoring Marable last week, but the breakdown was relatively flat. 37 snaps for CJ Marable versus 32 for Ricky Person Jr. We had 18 carries for Marable and 1 target versus 10 carries and 3 targets for Ricky Person Jr. So about a 60-40 split for opportunities in this offense for the Birmingham Stallions running backs. Person coming in at just $5,500, I think obviously makes him a really interesting tournament play, but the safer play overall for all lineup types going to be CJ Marable, and he's the one that I am going to be trying to get to here in week number 2 against the Michigan Panthers. The DC Defenders are 5-point favorites against the Houston Roughnecks at home to close out the weekend slate. A very underwhelming week number 1 for the DC Defenders running backs in general because they were chasing points against the San Antonio Brahmas pretty much the entirety of week number 1. Cameron Harris, though, did dominate the opportunities at running back for the Defenders. He had 48 snaps played versus just 20 for backup Puka Williams Jr. Puka only had 1 rush attempt and 3 targets in that trailing game script, where Harris actually ended up with 8 carries and 2 targets. So have to believe in a more favorable game script like the one we're anticipating in betting markets this week will be good news for Harris, getting a little more action on the ground and hopefully down near the goal line to score a touchdown or 2 and really boost our lineups if you play him at his $7,700 price tag. So Cameron Harris, definitely a running back that I'm interested in playing as well. With the San Antonio Brahmas, they are the other favorite on this slate. Clearly, Anthony McFarland, the best running back to play. McFarland, I would say, would be behind these other guys for a priority for me because I do think San Antonio going to be much more pass-heavy of an offense week in and week out. So looking to get exposure to the Brahmas through the air primarily here in week number 2. Low totals in the UFL. Every single game in week number 1 went under the final total number that the games went off at. So we've actually seen the totals come down quite a bit here in week number 2. The highest totals are 41.5 points for each of St. Louis and Arlington and Birmingham and Michigan here in week number 2. And our best teams as far as implied team totals, it's going to be the Birmingham Stallions, number 1 on this slate, thanks to their 24-point team total as 6.5-point favorites against the Michigan Panthers. We saw about a 70-30 split of reps at quarterback for the Stallions. Matt Corral took the vast majority of the dropbacks for the Stallions, but Adrian Martinez, with his rushing upside, is going to get a couple of series here and there with the Stallions. That is something that Coach Skip Holtz has actually put out there into the universe as something that he's going to continue to do is play both of these guys. He views them both as his starting quarterback. So not much separation, at least through the media, through the eyes of these coaches between these two quarterbacks, but very impressed with what Corral was able to do in a comeback victory against the Renegades in week number 1. And I do think he'd be an interesting high-risk quarterback here in week number 2 at a pretty high price tag of $10,300. Don't think Martinez is playable at his priced up $8,300 price tag, getting far less reps than Corral here in this offense. The number 2 implied team total offense, going right back to A.J. McCarron's St. Louis Battlehawks. Very underwhelming offensive performance for the Battlehawks against the Panthers, and it does look like there were potentially some offensive line troubles for the Battlehawks as well. McCarron was sacked 4 times by the Panthers defense. We'll see if they're able to bounce back here in the home opener against the Renegades, but very encouraging usage, obviously, with 37 dropbacks for A.J. McCarron. He's going to continue to sling the rock all over the field. Not much rushing upside for McCarron. No rush attempts in week number 1, and only averaged about 3 yards a carry in 2023 in this offense. So if we're playing A.J. McCarron, that means we definitely want to link up with one of his pass catchers, and very well could be Gallman. Gallman getting a decent amount of targets in this offense. But that's the way I would consider playing McCarron most optimally, is getting at least one stacking partner with him if I'm trying to take advantage of their high implied team total here in week number 2. DC Defenders have the 3rd highest implied team total at 23 points against the woeful Houston Roughnecks. We saw Ta'amu drop back and throw it 45 times. That was the most out of any quarterback in week number 1 in the UFL. Unfortunately for us, he did not really have a very high upside on those dropbacks. Very underwhelming performance for Ta'amu with just 227 yards on those 45 dropbacks, but the defenders did have a healthy 8.8 yard average depth of target on his throws. Have to believe that they will bounce back here and be a little bit more efficient if they continue to throw at that volume. This team is definitely a candidate for some regression that we can benefit from in week number 2 and beyond, given how they underperformed against the San Antonio Brahmas. And for Ta'amu, the best weapons to consider pairing him with are going to be Brandon Smith and Ty Scott. Ty Scott and Brandon Smith led this team in opportunities in week number 1 with 7 and 6 targets respectively. Ty Scott had the better box score day. Brandon Smith had more air yards than Ty Scott, though, with about a 35% share of the air yards in that matchup. Air yards courtesy of Pro Football Focus, who has that data available if you want to subscribe over to PFF and get full reports. But Brandon Smith and Ty Scott look like the best stack partners in Jordan Ta'amu lineups for high risk this week. Can't get out of here without talking about the Brahmas. Obviously, we were very, very high on Garbers at a low salary in week number 1. That has been corrected. He's now a very competitive $10,000 at quarterback, and his team is favored here to open the weekend slate against the Memphis Showboats. And his best weapons are going to be each of Marquez Stevenson and Jontre Kirkland at wide receiver. Kirkland had the big day in the box score with 19.1 fantasy points. Did not necessarily have tremendously encouraging downfield usage, just a 2.6 yard average depth of target for Kirkland versus a much more manageable 8 yard average depth of target for Marquez Stevenson on his 6 targets. So Kirkland just made the most of his 9 opportunities, catching 8 of those targets and obviously ending up with a touchdown in this game for Garbers and the Brahmas. But I would expect Marquez Stevenson to absolutely have an opportunity to explode if he continues to see 5+ targets a game at an 8 yard plus average depth of target. So for me, if I'm going to be stacking the San Antonio Brahmas this week, I'm going to be trying to leverage the Marquez Stevenson cheap salary of $6,800. Stevenson with a very, very encouraging target share as well of over 23%. If that continues to take place here against the Showboats, you're going to see these numbers in the box score get better and better for Marquez Stevenson, and apparently has some rushing upside. Got a gadget play as a rush as well in week number 1. So if that continues, he'll have even more upside as well. Cody Ladimer was our biggest disappointment in week number 1. We saw him have a relatively healthy 20% plus target share with the Orlando Guardians in the 2023 XFL. Just 1 target last week against the Defenders. Ran 19 routes, which was 7 less than team leaders Jontre Kirkland and Marquez Stevenson. So I think for now, we can definitely say he's firmly the 3rd option in this offense. But keep an eye on his salary. If it continues to creep down and we don't necessarily see some big games from Latimer and this usage stays relatively similar over the next couple of weeks, there will be a buy low opportunity here with Cody Latimer for sure. The Memphis Showboats are actually going to be my favorite high-risk stack this week. I was very encouraged by what I saw when I watched this game and what I saw when I looked at some of the underlying data for the Showboats. Going back to some of the air yard data here from week number 1, thanks to PFF, the Memphis Showboats had a 9.3 yard average depth of target. That was the third best in the UFL in week number 1. Case Cookus dropped back to pass 40 times in Memphis's victory over the Houston Roughnecks. I would expect him to continue to drop back at a high clip here. And there are receivers and tight ends that we can pair with him and feel very, very good about their chance to succeed in week number 2. First of which is going to be Daywood Davis, who led this team with 10 targets, led the UFL with 10 targets in week number 1, had just 7 receptions for 43 yards, no touchdowns here, had an expected 21 PPR points and only had about half of that number here. If his usage continues to be this encouraging, he's absolutely going to actually outperform that 12.8 number that we saw in week 1, and we can still get to him for a modest $6,600 here in week number 2. We also have Sarat, who had a very, very strong role as the tight end for the Memphis Showboats that is worth having in fantasy football. 7 targets, just 2 catches for 38 yards, and had a decent 9.9 yard average depth of target. He's listed, or at least he was listed in week number 1, as the number 2 tight end on the depth chart, but Wes Saxton, the number 1 tight end for the Memphis Showboats, is more of a pass blocker. He's just not really going to have a ton of opportunities in the passing game week in and week out. We've seen him on a few different spring football teams over the last few years, so that has typically been what his role is. And then we had the touchdown from the invincible junior himself, Vinnie Popei, with some really nice toe drag swag in week number 1 against the Houston Roughnecks on his 7 targets. Also had a very healthy 9 yard average depth of target. So he's also an option here. $7,200, more expensive than Davis, who I do think is actually more poised to have a big day. All of these 3 players are actually, I think, in better usage spots right now than the most expensive pass catcher on the Showboats, Jonathan Adams. So for me, my favorite high-risk stack this week is in the first game on the board, and that is Memphis against the San Antonio Brahmas. One other receiver that I thought came in priced a little too low this week, it's going to be Michigan's Marcus Sims. Sims had 5 targets last week, 2 receptions for 38 yards, but he's just $4,100 here, and he was actually the air yard leader for the Michigan Panthers in his targets from E.J. Perry. The Panthers actually had the second highest team average depth of target at 9.8 yards, and Sims actually over-indexed that at a 15.4 yard average depth of target. So some big plays for Marcus Sims are lying in his future here in this Panthers offense if that usage continues here in week number 2. So for me, I'm going to build a lineup by trying to start with Wayne Gallman at running back. I do think if you're playing low-risk contests, you want to also have C.J. Marable as a running back. My favorite defense is going to be the defenders against the Houston Roughnecks, 72.25 per player remaining. Favorite receiver this week is Daywood Davis. You can really do anything you want with the rest of your lineup here with some of the cheap receivers that I talked about in this video, especially this guy right here, the last one that I was talking about. That'll leave you with plenty, I think, to go any direction you want with your quarterback and your final flex spot. Good luck in week number 2 of the UFL season here, guys. My projections for week number 2 are completely free to OccupyFantasy.com Discord subscribers. They will be up and posted in our NFL UFL channel by tomorrow evening at the absolute latest. So if you're into playing some UFL fantasy football over the next 2.5 months here, Occupy Fantasy is the place to be, and we would love to see you in our Discord talking about this slate and all of the slates to come. Also have rankings for each of the showdown slates. We get 4 of them every weekend in the Spring Football League here, the United Football League. So if you're into playing single game football, I've got you covered there as well. Thank you for watching this video here, guys. Good luck in week number 2, and we'll be back next week to talk about week number 3 in the UFL.